What if the most dangerous soul in a valley was the one nobody noticed? What if the priest who preached salvation gave himself to something far older than heaven? And what if vengeance didn't arrive with fire or thunder, but with silence? The northern ridge of Seraphine Vale stood a house the villagers never named. They walked the long road to avoid it. They crossed themselves when its windows glowed. And when the wind rose, they swore they heard a song too old for scripture. This is the story of Isolde, a servant who became something more, a wife who vanished without a trace, and a priest who ended with hollow eyes lifted toward heaven. A story still whispered when the night wind carries that sound. What if the most dangerous woman in a valley was once the one no one dared to notice? What if the man who spoke most loudly of salvation was the first to kneel before a different altar? And what if vengeance did not come as a scream or a blade, but as silence that seeped into stone, into marrow, into memory? This is the story of Isolde, the Ridge House, and the fall of Father Damião Corvalli. A story the villagers of Seraphine Vale still whisper, though never too loudly, when the wind carries a sound that might be song. On the northern slope of Seraphine Vale, where farmland thins to rock and the trees grow bent as though something unseen presses them down, there stood a house no villager named directly. They called it simply that house, or the Ridge Place. Its walls were pale but never bright, its windows too narrow, its chimneys coughing smoke even when the hearths were cold. At dusk, its shadow stretched farther than its size should have allowed. And though no curse was ever spoken aloud, the people carried their baskets and their gossip along the long road to avoid passing too close. The Ridge House belonged to Father Damião Corvalli. To the valley, he was a shepherd. To his wife, Lucia, he was a duty. To himself, he believed he was a man of God. He preached with thunder in his voice, his fists striking wood as though each blow broke sin itself. He warned of purity lost, of eternal fires, of paradise reserved, only for the obedient. His voice could silence a crowd of merchants and bring farmers to tears. But houses are not fooled by sermons. The Ridge House knew otherwise. The first crack in the priest's armor came not with scandal, but with sound. On certain nights, when the wind wound itself through the valley's gullies and the soil smelt of stone, a song rose faintly, low, aching, wordless, not in Latin, nor in the Portuguese of the villagers. It was not even a song meant for ears. It was a song that seemed to belong to the earth. Some said it sounded like mourning, others like a prayer too old for scripture. It seemed to have no beginning and no end, as though one stumbled into it already half sung. That voice belonged to Isolde. She had come from the coast under circumstances no one dared question. To some, she was a servant. To others, a burden dressed as gift, a dowry of shame passed on to Father Damião and Lucia by relatives who spoke too quickly of generosity. She was not the kind of beautiful that painters adored, but the kind of beautiful that burned into memory. Not porcelain, but fire. Not delicate, but unyielding. Isolde spoke little. She moved like smoke through the house, quiet, but impossible to ignore. She never asked questions, never demanded, never smiled when others did. And yet, she drew the eye of every servant, every guest, every passerby. She drew, most dangerously, the eye of Father Damião. Lucia Corvalli noticed. She noticed the pauses in her husband's sermons, the way his voice cracked, not from passion but from hesitation. She noticed his prayers grew, shorter, his silences longer. She noticed how he lingered in the halls when Isolde walked by, how his fingers twitched as though reaching for something forbidden. Lucia was no fool. She had been raised in houses where appearances mattered more than warmth, and she knew the awara signs of a husband's drifting devotion. But this was no ordinary betrayal. This was a humiliation not from another wife's equal, but from one meant to serve. Lucia's pride would not tolerate it. At night, she pressed her ear to doors, her hand on cold wood, listening to whispers that never reached her. In the morning, she studied her husband's face for cracks. Her silence sharpened itself into a weapon, but no weapon pierced Isolde. One night, when the house groaned with the weight of wind, Father Damião stood outside Isolde's door. He whispered. Not scripture, not sermons, only words. Fragile words, soft words, human words. The door opened. What passed inside was never confessed. But from that morning on, the song grew louder, clearer. The valley wind no longer carried it away. It seemed to bend toward it, as though listening. Lucia did not scream. Rage froze inside her until it was sharper than steel. She watched her husband's prayers collapse. She saw him lose his place mid-sermon, saw his hands tremble as though invisible strings pulled them. He spoke less of damnation, more of mercy. He quoted not scripture, but fragments of dreams. And always, Isolde remained silent. Lucia could not bear it. One evening she stood before Isolde, her pride trembling in her voice, and struck her across the face so hard a tooth came loose. Isolde did not cry. She turned her head, blood trailing from her mouth, and walked barefoot across the stone, leaving small dark drops that dried into shapes the servants swore resembled letters. From that night on, she no longer sang. Her silence was heavier than her song had ever been. Lucia summoned Reuven, the overseer. He was a man whose loyalty lay only in coin and cruelty, and he listened without expression as she gave her order. That night, Isolde was torn from her bed and dragged into the courtyard. The air was sharp with frost. She was bound, stripped to the waist, and lashed 12 times. Not 13, not 11. Exactly 12. Each strike was meant not to punish, but to remind. You are nothing. You are beneath us. But she made no sound. Not one. Even when her knees buckled. Even when blood traced her spine. She lifted her eyes to the chapel's high window and stared. Reuven left her there, trembling but unbroken. He confessed later, when drink loosened his tongue, that he had feared her silence more than he would have feared screams. At dawn, Father Damião found her still on the stones. He lifted her himself, carried her inside, washed her wounds. No. Prayers spoken. No servants called. The house shifted that day. By week's end, Lucia was gone. Her gowns remained folded. Her jewels still shone in their cases. The carriage horses stood waiting. No road bore marks of wheels. Father Damião told the villagers she had gone to visit family. But no letter ever arrived. No messenger ever returned. Whispers grew like weeds. That she had been buried beneath the stone floor. That she had fled into the forest and been taken by shadows. That she had been erased, not murdered, erased. In her absence, Isolde healed. The scars remained, pale ridges across her back like words cut into skin. She did not hide them. She moved through the manor with a new stillness, as though every wall listened for her footsteps. And Father Damião followed. Always followed. Strange. Markings appeared on wood and stone. Circles within circles. Eyes without lids. Jagged stars that seemed to quiver in torchlight. No villager recognized them. They belonged to no scripture, no indigenous tongue, no sailor's map. And yet they were there, drawn on door frames, etched into the very beams. Servants fell ill. Children refused to sleep in certain rooms. Some fled entirely, whispering of shadows at the ends of their beds, of whispers breathed from beneath their pillows. Old women shook their heads and muttered of forgotten gods, gods dragged over the ocean in chains, gods who waited for blood to free them. They said Isolde was no longer just a woman. The chapel emptied. Where once benches strained beneath the weight of worshippers, now only a few came. And they left quickly, crossing themselves with trembling hands. Father Damião's sermons grew fractured. He spoke of rivers flowing backward, of doors that could not be closed, of numbers repeating until they broke the mind. His words mixed Latin with something older, something no villager could name. He wrote feverishly in journals no one dared read, pages filled with spirals, symbols, prayers that, bent into curses, he wasted away. His eyes hollowed, his cheeks sharpened, and still, he followed Isolde. It was a boy sent to deliver eggs who found him. The manor gates yawned open. The halls stood silent. Only the chapel door hung ajar. Inside, Father Damião knelt before the altar, clothed in white. His hands were folded as though in prayer, but where his eyes had been, there were only dark hollows lifted toward the heavens. Blood-traced symbols across the floor, curling and breaking into forms no villager dared name. Above him, the crucifix hung. Not shattered, not torn down, but inverted. Isolde was nowhere. The matter was closed as suicide. But no blade was ever found. No explanation offered. The fire and the song. The chapel was sealed. the manor abandoned. 5 winters later, the ridge house burned. No storm struck, no lightning, no careless lamp. Flames rose one night without warning and consumed it entire. In the ashes, no bones were found, no silver melted, no stone blackened. It was as if the fire had devoured not just walls, but memory. Only, the barren hill remained as it always had, but the valley did not forget. Children swore they saw a woman in white at the ridge at dusk. Farmers claimed the wind sometimes carried a hum too low to be human. Passing priests broke down at the chapel's sealed door, weeping without cause. Some said Isolde had never been mortal at all. Others whispered she had been mortal once. And that was the horror, for silence was not the end of her story. It was only its beginning. This is the tale of Isolde of the Ridge House, a song that became silence, a silence that became memory, and a memory that still, on certain nights, refuses to die. And so the house on the ridge burned, leaving only ash and silence. Yet the silence never felt empty. Some say Isolde still walks beneath the trees when the mist hangs low, her song threaded through the branches like a memory the earth refuses to forget. Others swear they've seen her reflection in chapel glass, staring back with eyes that are not her own. The villagers never rebuilt on that ridge. They let the soil reclaim it, as though the land itself warned them away. But when the wind turns, when the night is too still, when shadows stretch longer than they should, the song returns. It does not plead, it does not rage, it remembers, and those who hear it never quite sleep the same again.